My sister mocked my poor job at family dinner, calling me a corporate failure in front of our parents, but she had no idea I had just bought the company she works for and was officially her new boss. It was a typical Sunday evening in our parents' high-end suburban home in New Jersey, the kind of place where the silver is always polished and the air is thick with the scent of expensive potpourri and old, deep-seated resentments. My sister Vanessa was sitting across from me, her designer silk blouse shimmering under the crystal chandelier and her perfectly manicured hand clutching a glass of aged Chardonnay, like it was a scepter. For as long as I can remember, Vanessa has been the golden child, the daughter who went to the right prep school, married a man with a trust fund, and landed a high-profile marketing executive role at a leading tech firm in the city, while I was always the other daughter. I was the one who preferred hoodies to heels, the one who spent my nights studying for an MBA while working a grueling retail job, and the one our mother Adriana constantly compared to a unwashed dog because I didn't care about social optics. At dinner that night, my mother had just finished gushing over Vanessa's latest promotion when my father Christopher turned his cold, calculating eyes toward me and asked with a voice full of forced pity how my little temp job was going. I had intentionally told them I was working in administration for a new firm to keep my privacy, but Vanessa saw this as an opening for a public execution. "Oh, Dad, don't press her," Vanessa cooed, her voice dripping with a sugary poison that made my stomach do a slow, sickening roll. Sarah's just at that age where some people realize they aren't meant for the fast lane. She's probably just filing papers and fetching coffee for people like me, and there's no shame in being part of the working poor if that's all your talent allows. She laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the mahogany walls, and my parents joined in their smiles, full of a dismissive cruelty that I had lived with for 25 years. I looked down at my plate, feeling the heat of their judgment, but underneath the table, I was gripping my phone, which was currently vibrating with a notification from my legal team. The notification confirmed that the final signatures had been processed for the acquisition of Apex Media, the very company where Vanessa worked as a mid-level director. For 5 years, I had built a private equity firm from a borrowed laptop in a studio apartment, hiding my success from a family that had erased me from their hallway photos the moment I refused to pay for Vanessa's third destination wedding. I had watched them from a distance as they enabled Vanessa's entitlement, watching her use our parents' retirement fund as a personal piggy bank while I was eating rice and beans to build my empire. Vanessa kept going, leaning forward to pat my hand with a look of mock concern. "I actually have an opening for a junior assistant in my department, Sarah. It doesn't pay much, and you'd have to wear a uniform, but at least you wouldn't be a temp anymore. I could even let you use my old designer bags so you don't look so provincial." I pulled my hand away, looking her dead in the eyes, searching for a flicker of the sister who used to share a bedroom with me, but all I saw was a hollow, hungry ambition that had been masked by years of feigned superiority. "I think I'll pass on the assistant job, Vanessa," I said, my voice steady and low-cutting through her theatrical performance like a razor. "I have a big meeting on Monday morning that's going to require all my focus." My mother scoffed, rolling her eyes as she reached for the bread basket. "A meeting? For what, Sarah? Planning the office holiday potluck? You really need to stop pretending your little job is a career. It's embarrassing for the family when people ask what you do." I sat there, the blue light of my phone illuminating the dark corner of the room like a cold grave, realizing that the people who shared my DNA were currently celebrating my failure, while the woman they thought they were mocking was currently the person who held the deed to their dignity. I didn't argue, and I didn't defend myself. I simply waited for the exact moment when Vanessa felt most secure in her lie, knowing that in less than 12 hours, the working poor sister was going to be the one standing at the head of the boardroom table, deciding whether Vanessa even had a desk to come back to. The morning sun hit the glass facade of the Apex Media headquarters with a blinding clinical light that felt like a spotlight on the new life I'd spent years building in secret. I stepped out of the black town car, the cool morning air of Manhattan, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of my parents' dining room just 12 hours ago, and for the first time, I wasn't Sarah the unwashed dog, or Sarah the working poor disappointment. I was Sarah Miller, the managing director of Miller Private Equity, and today I was the woman who owned the floor beneath my sister's designer stilettos. I was wearing a charcoal gray tailored power suit that cost more than Vanessa's first car, my hair pulled back in a sleek no-nonsense bun, and as I walked through the revolving doors, the security guardsmen who had been briefed on the acquisition weeks ago straightened their postures and nodded with a level of respect that my own father hadn't shown me in a decade. I headed straight for the elevators, my heart doing a slow, steady thrum against my ribs, but as the doors were about to close, a manicured hand thrust between them, and Vanessa stepped to her face buried in her phone as she barked orders at someone on a hands-free headset. She didn't even look up at first, her voice a sharp, entitlement-fueled staccato as she complained about the new management rumors and how she hoped the new owners had enough sense to keep the high-value talent like herself. When she finally glanced sideways and saw me, her jaw didn't just drop. It practically hit the carpeted floor of the elevator. "Sarah?" She shrieked, her eyes raking over my suit and the expensive leather briefcase in my hand with a look of pure, unadulterated confusion that quickly curdled into a mocking sneer. "What on earth are you doing here? Did you actually take me seriously about the junior assistant job? I told you it was an opening, but showing up in a rental suit trying to look like a C-suite executive is it's pathetic even for you." She laughed, that same jagged sound from dinner, and leaned against the elevator while her eyes scanning me for fakes or knockoffs. "You do realize that the new owners are taking over the boardroom on the 40th floor today, right? If security catches you trying to sneak into a professional space looking like a bad extra from a corporate drama, they'll have you arrested. Just go back to the lobby, Sarah, and I'll see if I can get HR to give you an application for the mailroom. It's more your speed anyway." I didn't say a word. I just watched the floor numbers climb: 35, 36, 37, keeping my gaze fixed on the digital display while Vanessa continued her verbal execution. She started talking about how Mom and Dad were so worried about my mental state after my delusional comments at dinner about having a big meeting, and how Dad was already planning to contact a career coach to help me find realistic expectations for someone of my limited background. The elevator chimed as we hit the 40th floor, the executive level, where Vanessa, as a mid-level director, had absolutely no business being unless she was summoned. She stepped out, her expression shifting to a forced professional mask as she prepared to greet the new transition team, but she froze when she realized I was stepping out right behind her. "Sarah, I'm serious, get back in the elevator," she hissed, her voice dropping into a panicked whisper as she saw the former CEO and the board of directors standing in the reception area. "You're going to humiliate me. These people are actual power players, not the administration temps you're used to." I ignored her, walking toward the group of silver-haired men who were waiting with expectant smiles. The former CEO, a man who had spent the last 30 years ignoring people like Vanessa, stepped forward and extended his hand toward me, not her. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice booming through the quiet, prestigious hallway. "We've been expecting you. The final transfer of authority is ready for your signature in the boardroom." I took his hand, my grip firm, and my eyes finally shifting to my sister, who looked like she was witnessing a glitch in the simulation of her own reality. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and small against the backdrop of the empire I now controlled. "Vanessa," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning in the city, "I told you at dinner that I had a big meeting this morning. I just didn't realize you were the one who was going to be late for it." I walked past her, the scent of my successa, mix of expensive espresso, and the absolute crushing power of the truth obliterating the jasmine perfume she used to signal her status. She tried to follow, her voice a weak fluttering sound as she stammered about a misunderstanding and family jokes, but the two security guards I'd passed in the lobby stepped in front of her, their arms crossed. "Boardroom is for authorized personnel only, ma'am," one of them said, his voice a dead flatline. I didn't look back. I entered the boardroom, sat at the head of the mahogany table, and realized that while Vanessa was busy mocking my poor job, I had been busy becoming the person who held the pen that would decide the rest of her career. The boardroom door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the frantic, muffled sounds of Vanessa's protests and leaving me in a space that smelled of expensive leather, high-end filtration, and the absolute silence of true authority. I took my seat at the head of the polished mahogany table, the very same table where my sister had likely sat for years, preening in her director's chair and assuming that her golden child status made her untouchable. The board members looked at me with a mixture of professional curiosity and the wary respect reserved for someone with the capital to dismantle and rebuild their entire ecosystem overnight. I opened my briefcase, laying out the transition documents with a clinical precision that would have shocked my parents, who still viewed me as the unwashed dog, too provincial to understand a tax return. The former CEO, Mr. Sterling, cleared his throat and began the presentation, outlining the bloat in the marketing department, the very department Vanessa managed with an iron fist, and a designer wardrobe funded by our parents' dwindling retirement. Every spreadsheet Sterling pulled up confirmed what I'd suspected from the digital shadows. Vanessa wasn't a high-value talent, but a professional parasite taking credit for her subordinates' work while spending the company's travel budget on five-star hotels that she posted about on Instagram to maintain her pretty sister facade. As the meeting progressed, my phone began to vibrate on the table, the caller ID showing Mom, and I realized with a sharp, cold satisfaction that the news of my presence at Apex Media was already filtering down through the corporate grapevine. I ignored the call, focusing instead on the list of non-essential personnel. My legal team had drafted a list that featured Vanessa's name at the very top, highlighted in a way that felt like the ultimate receipt for 20 years of being told I was a failure. I instructed Sterling to summon the marketing directors for an immediate organizational realignment session, specifically requesting that Vanessa be the first one through the door. When the internal line buzzed and Vanessa was ushered in 10 minutes later, she had clearly tried to fix her makeup, but the frantic mottled red on her neck betrayed the fact that her world was currently spinning off its axis. She didn't look at the board members. She looked directly at me, her eyes darting toward the managing director plaque that had been placed in front of my seat, her mouth opening and closing in a desperate attempt to find the sugary poison she'd used so effectively at dinner. Sarah, there's clearly been a massive misunderstanding. She stammered, her voice lacking the sharp, entitlement-fueled edge it had when she was suggesting I apply for the mailroom. I didn't smile, and I didn't offer her a chair. I simply looked at her through the lens of a boss who was evaluating a failing asset, mirroring the cold, calculating gaze our father had used on me for 5 years. I opened her personnel filia, thick folder of mediocre ratings and complaints from junior assistants who she'd treated like unwashed dogs, and I began to read her own words back to her, specifically the emails where she'd mocked the low-budget drama of the company's recent struggles. The silence in the room was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of judgment that turned her expensive jasmine perfume into the bitter tang of impending professional execution. I told her that in light of the acquisition, every director was being reevaluated for cultural fit, and that her performance at Sunday's dinner had provided me with all the field data I needed to determine her value to the new Miller private equity era. Vanessa began to hyperventilate a performance she'd used since she was 6 to get her way or avoid a grounding, but this time the audience wasn't our enabling mother. It was a board of directors who only cared about the bottom line I now controlled. She tried to lunge for my hand, a pathetic, uncoordinated movement of unearned entitlement, but I leaned back, my expression as steady as a heartbeat, finally understanding that the woman who mocked my poor job was currently the one begging for a seat at my table. I told her she had 60 minutes to clear her desk of any props or designer bags she'd used to signal her fake status, and that if she was still in the building by noon, security would be instructed to treat her as a shady trespasser. As she turned to leave, her designer heels clicking on the floor in a way that no longer sounded like royalty, but like a landed fish struggling for air, I realized that the working poor sister was finally the architect of the family's new reality. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Dad saying, "Sarah, please call your mother as an estate," and I felt a surge of justice porn, so pure it was better than any profit margin I'd ever cleared. I didn't reply. I simply closed her file, signaled for the next director to be brought in, and realized that while Vanessa had spent her life trying to erase me from the family photos, I had just spent an hour erasing her from the only thing she actually valued, her unearned power. The morning sun continued to hit the glass facade of Apex Media, but for the first time in 25 years, I wasn't the one standing in the shadows of the golden child's blinding light. The marketing floor of Apex Media was a glass-walled hive of activity that usually hummed with the sound of Vanessa's sharp, demanding voice, but as she walked out of the executive elevators and toward her corner office, the silence that followed her was deafening. I watched from the security feed in the boardroom, my hands folded on the mahogany table, as my sister, the woman who had spent 20 years calling me a failure over pot roast, was forced to face the people she had spent years demeaning. Her subordinates, the very assistants she'd called unwashed dogs, stood by their cubicles with wide eyes, watching as the golden child began shoving her designer desk accessories and Executive of the Year awards into a cardboard box with trembling hands. The jasmine perfume she always wore like a weapon now seemed to suffocate her, and for the first time the entitlement that had been her shield was stripped away, leaving nothing but a terrified middle-aged woman who realized her beauty and social status couldn't negotiate with a legal acquisition. My phone on the table began to vibrate with a violent, non-stop rhythm, calls from my father Christopher and texts from my mother Adriana that shifted rapidly from "Sarah, pick up right now" to "How could you humiliate your sister like this?" I ignored them, focusing instead on the HR director, who was currently presenting me with a forensic audit of Vanessa's expense reports, which showed she'd been billing the company for the very Chardonnay we drank at dinner. Just as I was about to sign the final termination papers, the boardroom door was thrust open, and my parents marched in, bypassing security via a family emergency lie that I knew they'd used 100 times before. My mother's face was a map of dawning rage and foundation-streaked tears while my father stood there in his expensive wool coat, looking at me with a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal, as if I were the one who had mortgaged our family's integrity. "Sarah Miller, you stop this madness this instant." My mother shrieked, her voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city I now owned. "You come home, you apologize to Vanessa, and you fix this acquisition nonsense. We didn't raise you to be a corporate monster who devours her own blood." I didn't stand up. I simply leaned back in the CEO's chair, the leather creaking under a weight of authority they had never allowed me to possess at their dinner table. "You didn't raise me at all, Mom," I said, my voice dropping into that cold, clinical register that made my father flinch. "You tolerated me while you poured every ounce of your love and our retirement savings into Vanessa's miracle life, and now that her miracle has turned out to be a professional parasite, you're looking at the unwashed dog to provide a flea bath." My father took a step toward the table, his fingers gripping the back of a chair the same way he'd gripped the dining table when he told me I was no longer his daughter for refusing to pay for Vanessa's wedding. "We made mistakes, Sarah, but this is business, not a playground for your grudges." He rasped, his voice sounding skeletal and thin against the backdrop of my success. "You have millions now. You don't need this company. Just put Vanessa back in her position, give her a raise to cover the stress of this morning, and we can forget this ever happened." The level of entitlement was a physical weight in the room, a suffocating blanket of favoritism that I finally had the power to throw off. I slid the audit reports across the table toward him, showing him the red-inked reality of the daughter he'd put on a pedestal. "This isn't a grudge, Dad. It's an intervention," I told him, looking him dead in the eye. "Vanessa has been stealing from this company for 3 years the same way she's been stealing from your 401k, and the only reason she hasn't been arrested is because I'm the one who bought the evidence. You have 30 minutes to get her out of this building before I turn this file over to the DA and make her professional execution a criminal one." My mother started to wail, a sound I had been conditioned to respond to with guilt for 25 years, but now it just sounded like white noise against the soundtrack of my own liberation. I watched as security finally arrived to escort them out, my parents clinging to each other like refugees from a dynasty they had destroyed themselves, and as the doors closed on their protests, I realized that the working poor sister was finally the only one in the family who could afford to tell the truth. I walked to the window, looking down at the street where Vanessa was currently standing on the curb with her cardboard box looking small and sickly against the Manhattan skyline, and I felt a surge of justice porn, so pure it was better than any profit margin I'd ever cleared. They had 20 years to see me, 20 years to love me, and 20 years to be a family, but they only cared about my existence when they realized I was the one who owned the floor they were standing on. And as I turned back to the boardroom to begin the realignment of the marketing department, I knew that the golden child era was officially over, and the era of Sarah Miller had only just begun. The corporate realignment of Apex Media was more than just a business strategy. It was an exorcism of every insecurity my family had spent 25 years sewing into my skin, and as the months passed, the unwashed dog they had mocked became the most feared and respected name in Manhattan commercial real estate. I didn't just fire Vanessa. I systematically dismantled the culture of toxic entitlement she had built, replacing her with the very junior assistants she had treated like disposable trash, and watching them flourish under my leadership was a form of justice porn that no amount of money could buy. The forensic audit I'd presented to my father in the boardroom was the beginning of the end for Vanessa's social facade. Although I eventually allowed her to sign a private restitution agreement to avoid a criminal record that would have further humiliated my parents, the financial cost was absolute. She was forced to liquidate her entire designer wardrobe, sell her engagement ring from a marriage that was already crumbling under the weight of her lies, and move into a studio apartment in the same provincial neighborhood she had sneered at during our last family dinner. Her husband, a man who valued social status above all else, filed for divorce within 90 days of the acquisition, citing irreconcilable fraud, as he realized the woman he married was a professional parasite who had been stealing from her own company to fund their lifestyle. My parents didn't fare much better, with their retirement fund severely depleted to cover Vanessa's legal fees and the loss of the social standing she provided. They were forced to sell the high-end suburban home where they had erased my childhood photos. I heard through the grapevine that they tried to move in with Vanessa, but the two of them ended up in a vicious cycle of blame, my mother finally realizing that the golden child she had put on a pedestal was the one who had truly made them homeless. I, however, moved into a sun-drenched penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. I now owned a place where the air was always fresh, and the only scent was the expensive espresso I drank while reviewing my billion-dollar portfolio. My father sent me a letter on my 30th birthday, a tear-stained envelope asking for a small loan to save his architectural firm after Michael's latest failure, but I didn't even open it. I simply shredded it and went back to my meeting realizing that their love was a currency. I had stopped trying to earn the moment I bought their boss's desk. I realized that being the other daughter was actually my greatest strength because it forced me to build a life that didn't rely on the whims of toxic people who shared my DNA. I am no longer Sarah the disappointment. I am Sarah Miller, the woman who took her life back one legal signature at a time, and as I look out over the Manhattan skyline, I finally understand that the best revenge isn't just success, it's the fact that I no longer care if they know I exist. I spend my holidays with the family. I chose people who saw my value when I had nothing but a borrowed laptop and a refusal to be broken, and as I silence my phone to enjoy the sunset, I know that the working poor sister was actually the architect of the family's new harsh reality. The golden child era is dead, buried under a mountain of receipts and a reality they can't afford, and I am the only one left standing in the light. That's my read on it. I already know some of you are shaking your head right now. Tell me why in the comments. I want to see every angle.